Just take us through that some of those models that you use to describe how these things come about.
Sure, and this is really, again, it gives you the areas to look at for a fraud prevention or a fraud risk management program. So this is from Professor Cressy many years ago, a model attributed to him, the fraud triangle, which looks at three elements which cause a high risk fraud environment. So they're pressure, rationalization, and opportunity.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome, Nick Robinson. Nick, give us give us the quick spiel then about your career and where you are now.
So originally from the UK, came to Hong Kong in the late 80s and joined the police. So I spent 11 years in the police, finishing up as a detective in the Commercial Crime Bureau in the Fraud Squad, which was the National Fraud and Corruption Investigation Group within the force. Just after the handover, I left the police and joined Anderson, which is where we met, to set up their forensic practice in China. And then really for the last 20 years have been working with the Big Four, looking at running forensic practices, looking at issues of fraud, corruption, both investigation and preventative work. Currently now leading the Ankura Risk Forensic and Compliance team for Asia, again focusing on helping organizations and individuals address, look after and respond to issues of fraud, corruption, money laundering and different integrity risks.
Indeed. Well, look, the topic of today's conversation is employee integrity, and we'll get into what that is in a broad sense and the kind of issues that you've dealt with. But obviously, what's made everything more interesting in the last couple of years is obviously COVID-19. Do you want to give us that quick sort of then overview of that fraud, that risk area, and narrow into employee integrity?
Sure. So I think fraud and corruption are sort of headline issues. They're underpinned by integrity and underpinned by individual behavior. People commit fraud, not machines. This issue is on the table. People are addressing it, and people are beginning to understand it and beginning to see how damaging these issues can be to organizations' reputation. Corruption is a big focus, the payment of bribes and the receipt of bribes, and there's some interesting pieces of legislation which focus either on the bribe payer or the bribe recipient. And indeed, one thing I think is really interesting again, and it's probably a trend that's been happening over the last few years, is the link between fraud and corruption. So people don't use their own money to pay bribes, they'll often steal it first. So underlying any corrupt activity, there'll be the creation of a slush fund, either through asset misappropriation or financial statement fraud that is then used for the bribe payment. So how do you tie that back? It's individuals. It's not machines doing this stuff. It's not computers. There is an integrity of a lot of the data systems at the moment, which is important. But typically, as we look at the work we do, we track it back to individual behavior.
Okay. We'll come to COVID in a moment, but I know there are some, being the good consultant I am, there are some good theoretical models, right? The fraud triangle and so forth. So again, before we get into how COVID has amped all of this up, just take us through that some of those models that you use to describe how these things come about.
Sure, and this is really, again, it gives you the areas to look at for a fraud prevention or a fraud risk management program. So this is from Professor Cressy many years ago, a model attributed to him, the fraud triangle, which looks at three elements which cause a high risk fraud environment. So they're pressure, rationalization, and opportunity. So pressure is on individuals or organizations to make targets, to meet sales quotas, or indeed can be an individual pressure. Maybe investments have gone wrong, or there's family issues and they need funds. So there'll always be a pressure element. There's then an opportunity side where people will find a gap in the controls or will do something and they don't get caught, and then it will continue from there. And so that's particularly a concern at the moment because of the sort of, we'll get on to COVID, but on the remote working. And then the rationalization where people say, well, look, everyone's doing it, so why shouldn't I? And maybe I didn't get promoted this year, so I'm going to take my 10% from here and rationalize their behavior in that way. And that really gets down to the behavior and the sort of the moral compass of people in organizations.
I know that you guys added a sort of fourth part of it and made it a diamond. And was that because of COVID, or that was a fourth part of the diamond?
This was added several years ago. We can't take credit for that, but we're using it now as this capability. So this is the trait of the individual in that triangle, in those three sets of circumstances, and the trait about individuals. And I would always caution against generalizing and talking about human nature, but it's really looking about how people will behave, and people see the opportunity to commit fraud, and that's either asset misappropriation or the financial statement fraud.
Early last year, COVID comes along and forces us all now to evacuate offices and work remotely at home. And as we're all setting up our home offices and getting used to being on Zoom calls and so forth, what then have you guys observed about how COVID has or COVID's impact on what was already a challenging area?
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe go back a little bit for that. I think if somebody is offered a bribe, let's say, and is offered a bribe or a chance to do something, or maybe misappropriate some assets or something, they will ask themselves three questions. And I think this will tie back in to the COVID situation. They'll typically ask themselves, "Is it more than my job's worth?" If they're offered a bribe to do something, is this I'm going to go, I can move country, I can start a new life, I can actually sort something out. So is it more than my job's worth? The second one is typically, will I get caught? So there's this is along the same lines as parking a car illegally or speeding or doing other things. It's the question of, will you get caught within this structure? And the third one is it right or wrong? And typically, with people we see, they'll say it will become a situational decision. They'll say, because X, Y, and Z was happening, I did this. And so you'll see this concept of situational ethical decision making. And I think as you look at those three areas, it's really interesting to then overlay the COVID. People's are now in their own living rooms, let's say, but still responsible for an organization's reputation. They have lost an ability to connect with the organization, which typically will have programs that address those three questions. So if suddenly I'm sitting at home, and I've got to make a sales target and I've got to do something, suddenly that pressure is much more obvious to me, maybe because my personal life is much closer to me. The opportunity is there because actually I'm remote, no one's actually observing what I'm doing, and there's more flexibility or more blurring of that relationship. And the rationalization may be, actually, we now can't, if you ask me how much my job is worth, I can't see the future. I can't see what the organization is doing, because there's economic, social, and different levels of uncertainty. Sorry, that's a long answer to a shorter question.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, again, when we talked about it, right? So, what are those employee motivators? They're exactly the same as they were before COVID, right? So, yes, my interesting work, the work environment, the ability to progress, of course, rewards and recognitions, financial, non-financial. They were all there before. They're there now. But I guess what you're saying is, and the managing from home sort of angle is, we need to be super careful or super observant about those things, because we have the potential to lose people now that the distance, right, is more. So we're doing those things before, and maybe we're doing them okay, but there's a particular focus now on getting that right in this new hybrid work environment, because I don't think anybody is going to come back to the office full time, right? There's either going to be a couple of days here and there, or other companies, as we've seen on the news, really allowing us to sort of completely work flexibly. So those things were there. They're there now, but in this hybrid work environment, we need to pay more attention to them. That's essentially what you're saying, right?
Yeah, so I think you've got every individual. I think focuses on three things, and this is me saying I don't want to generalize, but I think they focus on three things. So career prospects, job nature, and reward or compensation. So the career prospects, they need to see where they're going in the organization. That's particularly relevant, I think, with a lot of job churn and a lot of turnover. And then the job nature, that they need to be happy when they come to work, what they're doing, or whether they're getting that they like what they're doing. And then the reward and compensation, and that's not just pay. That's the whole sort of engagement side, and the respect and the messaging around that. But those three things are like a tripod that need to balance. And I think with COVID, and indeed with a lot of the remote issues of now working all that, and it's not just remote working. It's this blurring of work life. Work life. it's not work-life balance. I think we've gone to work-life integration, where you're on your email on a Sunday morning because you can be, and you are, and it's to some extent it can be expected. So if you look at that tripod of career prospects, job nature, and compensation, trying to balance in that new environment, that's also a challenge.
In terms of going forward, then, and in terms of, I guess, sort of summarizing, from an employer's perspective, advice, learnings, or whatever, how would you what advice would you give?
I mean, the first thing is to understand the risk. I think the risks need to be refreshed because they're different now. You typically haven't got a panopticon compliance program where you've got this 360 view of what's going on. And then I think it's really three main things. It's really closing the engagement gap, getting stronger leadership, and really looking at that managing and leading from home. And this isn't getting your team on making sure they do 8 hours a day on Zoom so you can watch what they're actually doing. It's actually just it's that engagement and that culture drive around and getting that engagement gap looked at, reduced, and focusing on the leadership side. And then detection has to be part of it. Again, you have to have prevention, detection, and prediction with fraud and corruption as a program and a risk management strategy. And then it's then really learning around what your organization is doing, how a remote compliance culture can work.
Interesting. Okay. In terms of the new normal, the takeaway for me is that those fundamentals of employee engagement remain important. In fact, I think even manager capability needs to be looked at again, because I mean, management of people, supervision of people, in my experience, leadership is not natural, right? Some people, I think, yes, but that's why all the leadership courses around the world. So it doesn't come naturally to people. And now we've put this extra constraint on of managing remotely. I mean, that is almost a sort of parallel skill set there, along with the normal management leadership things, right?
And yeah, you're right. With COVID, with the economic uncertainty that underpins that, it's not just COVID and working from home. It's this changed economic model that we have, where suddenly we're not traveling. We're now, everyone is zooming and on these remote calls. It's a very different world. And yeah, I think there's a need for understanding that, and again, being negative and cynical. I think there's a big fraud and corruption risk with this detachment of people from the work environment, which I think is a concern.
Okay, great. Now let's test your integrity with a couple of ending questions. What's the main thing you would judge? What's the main thing you would typically judge a candidate on when you're interviewing?
It's interesting. So let me just say that these were the hardest, as we talked about. These are the hardest questions. To me, the thing I look for in people is attitude. I think a lot of stuff can be learnt. A lot of stuff can be picked up on the way, but people's attitude around, yes, certainly integrity, but also willingness to learn, willingness to fix problems, willingness to work as a team. So I think to me, its attitude is probably the key thing that I'll always recruit on. That, and then also a difference. So I need people within a team who are always slightly different. I think it reduces competition, but also looks for a slight difference and a diversity within a team, and different skill sets that are complementary. But primarily attitude. I think the attitude of people is 80% of what we look for.
Best moment, most elated moment in your career to date, and
So,
there is more career to come, but to date.
yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's a really hard one to answer. I think it's just been lots of different things. I think what drives me looking back on it, and looking back at my career, is helping other people succeed. So when I see people who, when I joined Anderson, I was assigned half a senior associate, and to see someone like that, yeah, well, 50%. To see someone like that now make partner is really exciting to me, and really that's what I find rewarding is setting people up to be successful, and helping people do that. That's pretty the passion I've got, and that's pretty those examples are probably the most important ones.
Nick Robinson, thank you very much. I appreciate you giving the time this morning, and look forward to catching up in the future.